What? Might as well. Good morning. Glad everyone's here today. It's looked like we've got a hole over there on that side, but hope everybody's okay. Hope everybody had a good week. Are there any prayer requests before we begin this morning? Will you bow with me, please? Our Father in heaven is so grateful for this day you've seen fit to give us. We thank you for the sunshine that brightens things up and puts a different outlook on things for us, Father. We're so grateful for this time which we can study your word. Father, we have a number of family and friends who are sick and struggling with illnesses. We ask that you be with each and every one and restore their health. Be thy will. In Jesus' name, amen. Daniel chapter 4, we just started verses, we read through verses 19 through 27 last week, and was just getting to get into it. And this is where Daniel is going to interpret the vision of Nebuchadnezzar. And we know how well Daniel did before when he interpreted his first vision, but now Nebuchadnezzar had a second one, and we just started getting into it. And I won't reread verses 19 to 27 unless somebody needs them reread. We could go through it. But in a nutshell, the king had this vision, this dream. He saw this tree which became larger and larger. It was in the center of the earth, and it just grew so big, and it was strong. Its height reached the sky. It was visible to all the earth, and all its foliage was beautiful. It covered everything. It provided food for everyone, for all the animals. There was a place for shelter underneath for the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air could stay in its branches. And it was a great thing, and it was visible by all. And then this divine angelic watcher come by and said, he come from the heavens saying, chop down this tree and destroy it, but leave the stump in its roots and wrap the stump with an iron band and let the dew of the earth come upon it. And I'm doing this all in a nutshell. I'm skipping over some things, but this was basically what the dream was. And Nebuchadnezzar, as his typical self, he wants to know what this means, because this is bothering him. And I'm going to wait for you, Ted, but decided not to. And, of course, Daniel calls in all his wise men. They couldn't do it. I'm sorry. Nebuchadnezzar calls in the wise men. They couldn't interpret the dream. And then Daniel finally gets there, and he's getting ready to tell the king what this dream is. So that's where we're at. Daniel getting ready to interpret the dream for the king. And this time the king didn't ask the people to tell him what the dream was in its interpretation, just the interpretation of the dream. And when Daniel recanted what the dream was, it horrified him, it scared him, because he knew what this dream meant. Daniel knew what the interpretation of this dream was, and it terrified him. I mean, partially could it be because he had some respect and feelings for Nebuchadnezzar because of how he was taking care of the Jewish people, how he had taken care of Daniel, how he had taken care of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even though he tried to kill him, what happened afterwards after the fiery furnace? He had some respect for the king. But Daniel was also concerned what was going to happen to the Jewish people, because he knew how Nebuchadnezzar was treating them at this point. And if whatever the meaning of this dream was that Daniel knew, there was a possible bad outlook coming to the Jewish people, possibly. And Daniel knew all this, so that's why it troubled him. And Daniel starts off saying, if this dream only applied to your adversaries and to those who hate you, that tells you it's not going to be a pleasant outcome to this dream, because you really never wish good on your enemies. But Daniel didn't want this dream or this outcome to be happening to Nebuchadnezzar, because it's going to be a bad outcome. Picking up at verse 20, we left off at 19 really last week, but we're picking up at verse 20 and 22. And Daniel's describing the dream exactly like Nebuchadnezzar did to him. He describes the tree, how big it grew, how the foliage was good, how it had fruit, how the animals and the birds all came to it. He described that to him. So he's letting Nebuchadnezzar know, this big tree, this great thing that you see, that tree is you. And that had to be hard for Daniel to say because of the respect that he had for Nebuchadnezzar. But he's now telling Nebuchadnezzar, that tree is you. Remember, Daniel's a captive, but yet he's higher up in the court of the king. The king has respect for him. He made him chief of all the wise men. But still, it had to be a little unnerving for Daniel, not for fear of his life, but for the results that's going to be happening and what Nebuchadnezzar may think or do afterwards. But he's telling him, King, that tree is you. Yes, your kingdom, it extended to all of the earth. It was one of the most powerful kingdoms at the time back then. That tree is you. That is your kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's empire was one of the greatest and largest at that time back in that day. And Daniel's saying, that tree, your kingdom, that tree represents you. But now we know some more of that dream, that the tree was cut down. And then we start getting into that in verses 23 and 25. And that's where Daniel's saying that the angelic watchers come by. He said, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stumps and roots. And we mentioned this a little bit last week. If you're cutting down a tree to get it out of your yard, what do you cut the tree down, you get rid of the wood, but you want the rest gone. So what do? You cut up, you grind the stump, you pull up the roots to make it go completely away. If you don't, what's that stump going to do? It might sprout and start coming back up. But in this dream, the angelic watcher said, put an iron band around the stump. What's that going to do? It's going to protect the stump that much more. Why would a kingdom that's getting cut down, taken away, which is Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, all of a sudden, this stump, which is still representing him, be protected? Because in the interpretation of this dream, we know that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be restored. And to do that, that stump, which is represented, has to be protected. So at some point, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come back in power, coming through, seeing how this stump is protected by that's wrapped in this iron and bronze, which has protected it. And it's going to be fed by the dew of the earth, so the dew of heaven. So that stump is going to get fed. It's going to get nurtured just by what's going on through everyday life. And through this interpretation, after the tree is cut, the stump is protected. Daniel's telling the king that, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the one that's going to be driven from mankind. You are the one that's going to have your place in the field with the animals. You are going to be the one that's going to be eating grass like the cattle. So this mighty, powerful king of one of the most biggest empires at the time has just been told his kingdom's going to be taken away. He's going to be out with the cattle, eating the grass of the field with them. And this is going to happen to him, and it would last for a period of 7 periods. We briefly discussed that, but we didn't go into what the 7 actually is. We don't know exactly what it is. Yes, Ted?
One of the things you do with the law to preserve it for longer once it's cut is to either put H figure spikes in the end or wrap it with a band to keep it from splitting. I think there's something in this about not just preserving it, but not letting it split, because sometimes when something like that happens, the nation splits, and it doesn't until Nebuchadnezzar actually regains his senses.
Good point. By splitting that could have made the kingdom, the Babylon Empire, go into different factions, different areas, and not be as powerful as it once was into individual sections. Is that what you're saying there?
I don't know.
No.
But it sounds like it's possible.
I mean, we're reading a lot into this, but all of these things make sense when we know what happens to a tree when you cut it down, when you protect a stump like that we see things happen and we can relate to that. And when you do these other things to protect it like that, it prevents other things from happening. And by Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar, the tree that is cut down is you, there's reason for that stump to be preserved in such a manner versus just sitting there. Great point on that. Anyone else before we continue? In Daniel, we're in verses 23 and 25 that we talked about before. This is going to last for 7 periods of time. We don't know exactly what the 7 periods is. We can speculate, we can guess. But we know it's a time frame that God has planned that this, whatever's going to happen here, is going to last in that time period. And I don't know why I'm saying verse 17, but this order is coming from the decree Most High. It's this angelic watcher who was saying this thing is not necessarily the one that is making this decree. He's the messenger that's giving what's going to happen to this tree is being cut down, and it's going to last for X period of time, and what's going to happen afterwards during that. And then starting in verse 26, as it said in there, leave the stump and the roots, and then his kingdom would be restored. As I mentioned last week, this dream started off as an object, as a tree, and then later on in this, it became a person, it became a him. And as like I said, Daniel said, this tree is you. Now we see it's a him. And as we go through the interpretation, leaving the stumps and roots, in verse 26 here, that his kingdom would be restored, referring to Nebuchadnezzar after this time period had lapsed. And some things had to happen during this time period. And at the end of verse 26 there, it's leave the stump with the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you, this is Daniel interpreting, talking to King Nebuchadnezzar, after you recognize that it's heaven that rules. We've got to remember, Nebuchadnezzar worked up many gods. And Daniel, on a couple of different occasions here, said, God of heaven has given me this. God of heaven has interpreted this for me to let you know this. And here, Daniel, given the interpretation of this dream, is after you recognize, King Nebuchadnezzar, after you recognize that it's the heaven that rules. King, you're not the one that's got control here. It's God of heaven that's in control. Nebuchadnezzar was a very prideful man. A lot of his stuff, he was I, me. Something goes wrong, he gets corrected. Praise to God. Then he goes back to his normal ways. So something's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar here through this dream, that he was going to become eat like the cattle. His power is going to be taken away. But it will be restored, as Daniel's saying, after you recognize that it's heaven, the God of heaven, that's in control. Pretty much we could be done with the dream there. You know, he's been given his advice. Here's what the dream is. Here's the interpretation. Here's what's going to happen. It's to you. Here's what's going to happen to you, King. Your kingdom is going to be taken away. You do these certain things. You recognize God of heaven. Your kingdom can be restored. But verse 27 is an interesting verse here. Daniel's, talking to the king. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Remember, Daniel's in his court. Daniel's his wise man. Daniel's an advisor to the king. He's giving the king some advice here. And this advice isn't just Daniel winging it off the cuff saying, hey, maybe if you do this or don't do that. Daniel knows this from God, because Daniel can't make these promises to the king without having some inside knowledge, so to speak, without knowing from God. And he goes on to say, break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. We see quite often that when God says something, if you do this, I'm going to do that. No choice in it. But we also see that God has conditional judgments, like what he did with Jonah and Nineveh. That, hey, Jonah, go tell them, stop sinning, I'll spare them. So it wasn't just, I'm going to go wipe them out, but if they stop, they'll be spared. And we see in Jeremiah also, in chapter 18, where God's talking about the Israelites there in verse 7 and all the way through 10, but I'm just going to read 7 and 8. It's, at one moment I may speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to uproot, to pull down, or destroy it. If that nation which I have spoken to turns from its evil, I will relent concerning the calamity I planned on bringing to it. So really, Nebuchadnezzar has an option here, that if you stop sinning, if you turn to righteousness, this destruction to your kingdom, what might happen to you, might not happen. He's given a conditional choice here. So we don't know if he takes that choice or not. We don't know what the situation was going through Nebuchadnezzar's mind at that point. But Daniel did give him, I don't want to say a choice, but he gave them the information of saying, break away now, not later, not next week, not next month, not next year. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness. And he spelled out what he needed to do. So it wasn't just stop sinning and go do righteousness, but he says, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be prolonging of your prosperity. So the king knows what his outcome can be, but he also knows he has a choice here to make. He knows there might be something that could spare him and prolong his kingdom there if he were to do what Daniel says and turn from his evil and start doing righteous. And we know Nebuchadnezzar knows that everything that Daniel said regarding dreams is true and factual because of what has happened before, even though other things of that dream didn't come true. The king understands the authority that Daniel has through God, and the king acknowledges it, but he seems to forget it time after time after time. And at this point, we don't know what the king's going to do until we continue reading through chapter 4. Any questions on this? Hope I didn't lose you on some of this stuff that I'm going through here. We know the dream. We know the interpretation. So now what happens? Time's going to pass. We're going to read Daniel 4:28 through 33. All of this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. So we know everything that we just talked about is going to happen to him. And the account here in chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar giving the account. He starts off as a first person talking, then he goes to third person, then he goes back to first person. And right now, this is Nebuchadnezzar talking about what's happened, going to happen in the third person. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from the mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize the Most High as ruler over all the realm of mankind and bestows on it whomever he wishes." Immediately, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like spurred claws. So, for some reason, 12 months passed from the interpretation of the dream, which the king knew what would happen, to this instance right here. Whether that 12 months was God giving the king a chance to change his ways, we don't know. Whether it was just a period of time that just passed, we don't know the reason why it was a period of time that lasted. Why didn't God make it happen immediately? Apparently, he gave Nebuchadnezzar a chance to change his way, but he didn't. And as we read, 29, 12 months later, and all of a sudden the king's on the roof. Why would a king go on to one of the most high spots of his palace? Remember how arrogant and prideful he is. I can see you all here. I I stand up here, I can see even better and I can see further out. If I'm a king and I want to see my kingdom, I'm going to get to a very high place. I'm going to get, well, not me, I'm afraid of heights. I'm going to get up on the roof and I'm going to look at my kingdom. I'm going to look at what I established. And that's how Nebuchadnezzar was. It was all about me, I, him. So he's out there looking at his Babylonian empire, things that he established. Look how great I am. Is he arrogant saying, what does this Daniel know? He said I was going to lose my kingdom, it was going to be taken away from me, and I'm going to start eating with the cows out in the field. But look what I built. Nobody can take this from me. How many times did we hear Nebuchadnezzar say in the first 3 chapters, there's no God that can harm me. There's no God that can take things away from me. Who can do this? That's how prideful he was. And we're starting to see it here. And it wasn't much after that as he's boasting how good he is, standing on his roof, looking out, saying, look at the glory of my majesty. As he's speaking, the words are coming out of his mouth. We hear he hears a voice in verse 31. And it wasn't just a voice spouting words. It starts off, King Nebuchadnezzar. There is no doubt who this voice was talking to. There is no doubt Nebuchadnezzar knew that this message that he's about to hear is for him. It's for him. It's not for anybody else in his kingdom. This message is for him. And I can only imagine what would be going through his mind right now. He was just boasting of how his kingdom that he built. And all of a sudden he hears this voice. Did that dream go through his mind? Yes, Brett.
Well, you know what I was thinking, and I read that is it's kind of got significance. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was on the highest point, looking down on everybody else, and he was on top of the world basically. And then it hit him that there was somebody above him, looking down on him with everything that God created. It made, and you know, and I think it's kind of a,
It's
way up higher.
ironic how he was doing that, right? He's saying how high he is, but how many times did Daniel say the God of heavens? So there's somebody higher than him if you look at it at a point like that. And it's not registering to Nebuchadnezzar yet. Even though he recognized it once or twice in the past, yes, the God of the kingdoms does this and that, but it's not sticking with him. And at this point, he's at the, as you mentioned, one of the highest points in the city, looking out there. There's a higher authority than him, and that authority is about to speak to him. And the voice says, it doesn't say who the voice is. It's just a voice. In verse 31, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. And that the sovereignty, his power, it's his dominance, his supremacy, it's his kingdom. Exactly what the dream said. It's being removed from him. It's being taken away. He didn't lose it. It was taken from him. And the voice goes on, continuing 32 and 33 through this whole setup here, and almost recanting what the dream is, not the specifics, but this is going to last for a period of 7 periods, which we said, we've seen 3 or 4 times before in here. This is going to last for a duration. And the duration basically is until you recognize you did wrong and you recognize the authority of God. That's what the duration is. Whether it's 7 days, months, weeks, years, not that important. But it's the time that's lasting for him to recognize what he did and to recognize the power of God. And that the God is ruler most high and he rules over all things. As Brett was saying, if the king is on the top of his palace roof boasting, there's somebody higher, and that higher authority is God. We're grateful that God doesn't give immediate judgment, because we'd all be in a world of hurt. But in this instance, as Nebuchadnezzar was speaking, his judgment came immediately at that point of what happened to him. He lost his power at that point, and all of a sudden he, what does it say in verse 33? Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle. It didn't say it took months for that to happen. Immediately this happened, he was driven away out of his kingdom. Yes, it immediately happened then, but it took 12 months for that time period to happen. He was given a chance to do what Daniel said, Daniel's recommendation, stop your evil doings, do righteousness. 12 months later, it didn't stick with the king, he didn't do it, and here's the result, which was actually what happened to the dream. He was driven away, kingdom taken from him, and he's starting to eat grass like the cattle.
I think you could say that he was actually even longer than that because his contact with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and things that have come before this for a number of years.
Yes.
There was a climax there when he had his second dream.
12 months from this dream, but I mean, from the initial conversations he had with Daniel, once Daniel.
It's been years.
Exactly. So he's in multiple times to turn from his evil doing and do righteousness. Reading through this, to me, it looks like after the first dream, he kind of got a little better than he fell back. And then when he had some of these other things, he got a little better than he went back. And like here, I think he might have got a little better for those 12 months, and then he went back. I mean, he had opportunity to change completely, but he never did it. We can see that he never did it. But my gut says he might have changed for a little bit and then just fell back to his normal, evil self. Yes, Larry?
Think about David. If God rendered immediate retribution for the sins that was committed, my choice wouldn't be David, it would be Joshua or Caleb.
Yes.
But they say, the Bible says that God, or David was a man after God's own heart. How do you figure that?
I mean, you can't look at all the instances bad. You look at the whole thing, and the good outweighed the bad for David. But
God gave immediate retribution for the problems. Think of all the things David did wrong. What he did.
we think of David, we think of these, then we can look at our own lives, what we did wrong.
Well, you go farther back than that. Israel would have been wiped out.
Yes.
And before that, Adam and Eve would have been wiped out. There would have been no humankind. And there's examples of that all through the Bible.
Absolutely. Bill?
But, how would we apply that to our lives? How many chances has God given us? And then there's gonna be a time where all of a sudden, we're done with all of our chances. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's still getting another chance because he's out in the field and stuff like that,
Right.
but, God is only patient for so long. And there's gonna be a time that when all mankind, there's gonna be a judgment. And what are we doing with all the chances that he gives us? And we're not even sure if we're gonna get home from church today.
Right.
So how are we living our lives to, by no fault of our own? By the fault of somebody else or something like that, it could happen. And how do we live our lives thinking that judgment is just around the corner?
In a sense, this is a Babylonian version of the prodigal son.
Yes. It truly is. Bob?
In the book of Acts, the guy gave a salutation and didn't give God the credit, and he got quick and he was gone. Weren't days was in.
So,
You have to be careful.
I mean, we can take away from this, we've been given chances time after time after time, and it just goes to show we need to live righteous as best we can each and every day. Because, as Bill pointed out, we're not guaranteed anything. We might not make it home tomorrow. We might not make it home tonight. So it's how do we live our lives each and every day? Terry?
To me, this is something about the danger of arrogance. Arrogance is a terrible thing, and it can be on a huge empire-wide basis here. But this fellow says, I've got authority over all of these people, and I can do anything I want, and I can kill whoever I want, and get away with it or whatever. But arrogance can be in small worlds also. It can be in just a family. Husband, wife, children. And the father can be arrogant, the wife can be arrogant, even sometimes children can be arrogant and control the whole family. To me, a good illustration of this is a fellow that probably hardly anybody in here has ever heard of. Now, we know we've got a guy that's a dictator running Russia, and if he gets mad at somebody, somehow in a week or two, they end up dead. You know, of course, he didn't do it, but they still end up dead. But there was a fellow named Hoxha, Hoksa, I think is how you spell it. Anybody in here ever heard that name? You have? Where'd you hear about Hoxha?
He's political, he's into some kind of political party or something.
No, he's dead now. He's been dead for a little while. Okay, but Hoxha ran a country called Albania, which is still there. It's a country today. Well, hardly anybody ever goes to Albania. They're dirt poor. Nobody has an interest in going to Albania. One time I was on a ship going between Italy and Greece, and the ship was coming alongside Albania, and I thought, this is the most forsaken country I have ever thought of. There was a road there. There were no cars or trucks on the road once. Every 30 minutes there was one. It was like barren. Okay, to the rest of the world, Hoxha was unknown. Okay, but in Albania, he was a little god in that country. He made all the rules. He sent people to prison. He killed people. He had unlimited authority in that little world of Albania until he died. Now there's a museum in that country of his possessions and the fancy life that he lived in, whereas the whole country was poor. I mean, like really poor.
Except
and he
him.
could care less because he was at the top of the heap, you know? Now, it shows how that you can have arrogance at a family level. You can have arrogance in a tiny little country where nobody outside that country even knows you exist. But in that country, oh man, you are everything. And you can have today a fellow that's ruling, what, 120, 150 million people in Russia? And he's arrogant. And when he makes speech, you can tell his arrogance. Well, anyway, arrogance is terrible. And it can be at any level, in any kind of group, and it's always bad. It always ends up wrong. It always ends up wrong.
I mean, we definitely see that with Nebuchadnezzar here. And it's unfortunate you see arrogance happen more often in people in authority and things like that. Where there's the power that goes to their head, don't know, but it's quite common there. And it's unfortunate that, you know, rulers of governments have that arrogance. They think they're untouchable. They think they can do no wrong, that their way is the only way. And it's unfortunate that things like that happen. Yes, Bill?
I think sometimes people don't accept Christ because they're arrogant and don't think that they need anybody. It can be on an individual basis, not just within an interpersonal relationship, but in their spiritual relationship, they can just say, you know, what's he done for me? Look how good I'm doing. I don't need him. I mean, and how many people are in the world that we hear they're talking about that? That's their attitude. They're
Right.
arrogant toward God. It's like, I don't need you.
Look how good I'm doing by myself.
Right.
That's true in so many cases. It's look what I've done for me versus, you know, how did I actually get here? So arrogance and pride is huge among things, and it's definitely downfall for many different people. Great comments. Anything else before we continue? Ending up the chapter, no, not chapter 4, ending up verse 33. It talks about what is Nebuchadnezzar going to turn into, so to speak. That yes, he's going to eat grass like the cattle, and his body's going to be drenched from the dew of heaven, so he's getting caught into where he's going to be living and how he's going to be living. And it goes, he had hair, had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. So he's adapting, his body is adapting to what the nature that he's starting to live in. And Babylon back then is in today, present day Iraq. So that tells you roughly the geographic area it is. And the sky is covered in feathers. And we know that Iraq gets hot. You know, a lot of times during the summer it's reaching 100 plus degrees in the summer. And even though it's in the Middle East, they do have some cold winters. In some of their winters, it has gotten below freezing over there. Current day. Back then was probably no different. So for Nebuchadnezzar, for however long he lived like this, as living with the cattle and whatnot, I don't want to say his body just changed. God was there, had his hand in this to make sure that Nebuchadnezzar did survive. Because how many of us, if we got taken out of something, we're put outside, would our hair grow like feathers and our hands and that grow like, like eagle's claws? Yes, our nails might get long, but will we do anything to cut them, keep them short? Will we cut our hair, do whatever? But he was adapting to his environment. He was adapting to so he could survive in that environment through the heat, through the cold. And it's not like he needed the claws to be eating meat or anything, because we know that he's eating the grass of the field like the cattle. So it's not like he's a carnivore out there that needs to go out and get some meat. He's eating grass. So, but his body has changed with the feathers as he's come out to be like, and his nails are like birds' claws. This sounds harsh, but remember, he's being punished. Yes, Ted?
I've never looked at it that way, and I'm not sure if you're right. I think this might be a description of the fact that his hair got long and his nails got long because he was in a state of being an animal to the point where he didn't even think about hygiene.
I was going to go to the next one. But yes, you know the story, so.
But I don't know that this, because in the translation I have, and I know that everyone's a little bit different, it doesn't state it, I don't think, the way that you said. It says that, what will it do of heaven until his hair grew as long as eagle feathers? It doesn't say
Okay.
that. Yours maybe.
Mine said like.
Yeah, which could imply what you're talking about, but I'm not sure if that's what the original word means. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That was the one snaps I was given that I was going to say. But others are saying that the situation of Nebuchadnezzar's mind was almost like he went insane. He didn't know what was going on, which would mean that he would let himself go, which is like going to what Ted was saying. His hair got long. He didn't trim it. He didn't groom his nails or anything like that. And he didn't understand what was going on about him, and these things were just happening to him, where it doesn't necessarily literally have to be that he became feathers. Does he have feathers?
This
That's-
tells both the state of mind and period of time.
Yes.
Because in order for it to get as long as what it's describing here, the period of time has to
It'd
be
be
fairly lengthy.
correct. Bill?
Well, if it says he has a mind like an animal, what are animals worried about? They're worried about survival.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I know, some animals are praying and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, their basic deal is food and survival. And so, when it says his mind was like an animal, that's all he was worried about. He was worried about survival.
Correct.
And he's crazy. And sometimes we see people that are touched or have some mental issues. A lot of times you look at them and their hair is long, scraggly. They don't care about it. They don't think about any of that stuff.
No.
A wild horse doesn't groom its own hooves or brush its own hair.
No. Yes.
Would not the fact that his nails are long and his hair is long be included with the 7 times then?
Ted mentioned that as well. It had to show some length of time, because it wouldn't have happened overnight. I mean, you see some people that have real long nails. How long did it take their nails to get that long? How long does it take somebody's hair to grow real long? I mean, we all know, okay, I go to the barbershop every 4 weeks. My hair gets this long in 4 weeks. So how long would it take to get? But yeah, I mean, we're talking long, straggly, I mean, real long hair. So we don't know. as both Mike and Ted, saying there, by the description of what's happened to Nebuchadnezzar, a time period happened. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen within a short period of time for this to happen to him. So we know there is a length of time here. What the amount of time was, we don't know. It doesn't really matter. But a length of time here happened for him to change like this and become what he is here.
He didn't choose this to be this way.
No.
Verse 32 says,
Oh.
You will be driven away from mankind, and you will be given grass to eat. They weren't letting him die, but he couldn't live among people.
No.
He was out of his mind. It says in verse 34 ahead of time, my
That he-
reason returned to me, or my knowledge returned to me.
Correct. But like you mentioned, he was driven from, so he was pushed out away from mankind, and he was given the grass to eat, to be this way. He didn't have a choice in this matter. So,
Because he wasn't acting normal.
correct.
He
What-
was gone for a while.
I mean, there's nothing to prove that he was mentally unstable, he was crazy, insane, or whatever. But by his actions and what he did, he was not in the right mind to be a ruler of a kingdom, number one, let alone to even care for himself, groom himself, and give himself their own provisions. He was given grass to eat. So we know that he was not in a right mind of state at this point.
And what's the point? The point is that he was saying how great I am and what I have done. And God says, that can be taken away from you in 1 second.
And it was.
And God took it away, that power from him, in 1 second. And then who's listening to what he says anymore?
Nobody. No, it had to be later on very humbling for him to go from such a prestigious power to a man eating grass out in the field looking as he did to what we're going to read later on in, the rest of the chapter. I'm filling 3 minutes so we don't start the next section. So we get started with verses 34 to 7 about the vision being fulfilled, but then we'll just backtrack again next week. Any more comments on this? Any questions about what had happened with this? Make it an easy question, Tom. Okay.
I just was going to say, I've been reading through Leviticus, and it's interesting in the 26th chapter, after God's been laying out the law for the people, he says to them, if you'll continue to do what I asked you to do, he says, I'll give you peace, you'll be able to sleep with no cause for fear, I'll rid the land of wild animals, keep your enemies out of the land. In fact, if your enemies do come in, 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 will chase 10,000, and all that. So he goes through all of the things, the land will produce in abundance and whatever. And then you get a little further down and it says, however, if you do not listen to me or obey all these commands, and if you break my covenant by rejecting my decrees, treating my regulations with contempt, and refusing to obey my commands, I will punish you. And then he goes on with an equally long list of things that are going to happen. It's going to get progressively worse and worse and worse. And so I think the idea was to the Jews, they're living the worse and worse and worse. They're in captivity in Babylon. God said, at the very worst, that's what's going to happen. We're going to be, he goes on, he says, we're going to pile dead bodies on top of dead bodies. That's how bad it can get. So it's kind of one of those deals where, that was a very graphic way. We see the Jews suffering because of disobedience. We see Nebuchadnezzar suffering because of disobedience. In all ways, God gives a way for them to come back. The rest of the story next week.
Yeah.
About what happens and where Nebuchadnezzar ends up. And so it's always, I think, about God's call to us to change and be his people. And our human desire to be our own people and to pursue the things that make us happy here. And God wants us to see that his ways are better. And he will ultimately bless us, but it may not necessarily appear like that along the way. So I think Nebuchadnezzar's, and we're able to sort of learn from his bad example, that this is God's cycle. He wants us to be his people. And when we refuse, not that we're always going to have bad things to do, but he always wants us to come back.
You made a great point there that just stuck with me. There is always a way back. And as we talked about, but there might not be the time to get that way back. But there is always a way back to God. No matter how far we've gotten from him, there's always a way back. But the question is, did you do it in time? So, great comments there, Tom. Anything else before we go? Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.